The smoke has cleared, but the ruins remain. Across the scarred landscape of what now calls itself the United States of America, the year 1783 reveals a nation born not whole but fragmented, not triumphant but haunted by the very violence that brought it into being. In the burned towns scattered across New York, New Jersey, and the Carolinas, blackened chimneys stand as monuments to a revolution that consumed as much as it created. The war is over. But peace feels less like resolution and more like exhausted silence. Drive through the Hudson Valley and you will find loyalist estates standing abandoned, their windows shattered like broken promises, their names deliberately erased from property records as though architecture itself could be made to forget. These were not merely houses but symbols of allegiance to a crown now repudiated, of choices that history would not forgive, of the uncomfortable truth that revolution requires not just heroes but also villains, and that the line between them often came down to geography and timing rather than virtue. The emptiness of these homes speaks louder than any manifesto, telling stories of families fled to Nova Scotia or England, of property seized and redistributed, of a new nation built partially on confiscation dressed as justice. Further west, along the shifting frontier zones that mark the contested boundary between settlement and wilderness, indigenous villages that once maintained careful diplomatic relations with the British Crown now lie displaced or destroyed. The Seneca towns of western New York have been systematically burned by Continental forces in campaigns that carry the clinical name Sullivan Expedition, but represent something far more visceral: the elimination of communities, the destruction of orchards and granaries, the message written in ash that there will be no place in this new republic for those who chose wrong. These were not enemy combatants in any traditional sense, but peoples whose centuries-old presence on the land became inconvenient to a revolution that promised liberty while demanding conformity. Even the sites of American triumph carry the stain of impermanence. Former Continental Army encampments decay quietly back into fields, leaving no monuments to the unity that supposedly forged a nation. The soldiers who weathered Valley Forge and marched to Yorktown have dispersed, many unpaid, many embittered, many wondering whether the revolution they fought was the same revolution that emerged victorious. The physical traces of shared struggle fade faster than the rhetoric suggests they should, as if the very earth knows that the story being told about birth of a nation doesn't quite match the messy reality of competing interests, regional tensions, and compromises that made victory possible. The new United States exists. Certainly 13 colonies transformed into 13 states, a confederation of sorts, sovereign and recognized by European powers. But it exists amid physical wreckage and unresolved social collapse that nobody quite knows how to address or even name. This is not the clean break with the past that revolutionary rhetoric promised. This is something stranger and more troubling. A beginning that carries too much of what came before. A freedom proclaimed but not yet practiced. A nation announced but not yet built. Absence dominates the landscape more powerfully than presence. Missing are the communities displaced by war, the German farmers of the Mohawk Valley who made the mistake of neutrality, the black loyalists who believed British promises of freedom and found themselves betrayed or relocated. Missing are the treaties that might have governed relations between the new nation and indigenous peoples, replaced instead by military conquest and forced cessions. Missing are the promises of the revolution itself, that stirring language about human equality and natural rights, somehow not extending to the hundreds of thousands still held in bondage, somehow not protecting the sovereignty of nations whose land this revolution was fought upon. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the mighty Six Nations whose diplomatic sophistication and political organization had helped maintain balance in northeastern North America for generations, faces systematic punishment for wartime alliances that, from their perspective, were entirely rational choices between competing imperial powers. Their lands are seized, their towns destroyed, their confederacy deliberately fractured by a young nation that seems to have learned from empire how to expand at others' expense while calling it liberation. The longhouses burn, and with them burn centuries of accumulated wisdom about how diverse peoples might coexist through negotiation rather than domination. And what of the enslaved Africans who heard revolutionary rhetoric about liberty and natural rights, but remained in bondage despite it all? They had watched white colonists declare that all men are created equal, while making clear through law and practice that men was a category with racial boundaries. Some had run to British lines, believing promises of freedom in exchange for military service, only to find those promises honored inconsistently or not at all. Others had stayed, or had no choice but to stay, and watched the revolution end with their status unchanged, property still, humanity still denied, freedom still deferred to some theoretical future that never seemed to arrive. The revolution changed regimes, but not the fundamental fact of their bondage. The new nation, like the colonies before it, would run on stolen labor even as it celebrated stolen land. Revolutionary ideals survive, primarily in pamphlets, declarations, and speeches, beautiful words about consent of the governed, about life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, about government deriving its just powers from the people. These documents circulate and are celebrated as founding texts, as sacred writ of American identity, but they survive on paper while daily practice tells a different story. The freedom declared in Philadelphia's State House exists in an increasingly complicated relationship with the freedom actually experienced in Charleston's slave markets, in displaced Mohawk villages, in debtors' prisons where former soldiers rot for want of wages. The bankrupt Confederation cannot pay. The origin story of the United States, even as it is being written and mythologized in these immediate post-war years, feels incomplete and morally unsettled. There is something not quite right about the narrative taking shape, something that doesn't align, a gap between the revolution that was fought and the revolution that is remembered, between the nation that was promised and the nation that actually exists. Historians will spend centuries trying to resolve this dissonance, trying to make the pieces fit into a coherent story of American founding. But perhaps the dissonance itself is the story. Perhaps the United States begins not with clarity, but with profound contradiction, not with unity, but with fundamental divisions, papered over by soaring rhetoric and willful forgetting. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy the work we do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Whether you're watching this in the quiet morning hours or during your evening wind down, whether you're in Boston or Bangalore, Philadelphia or Perth, your engagement helps us continue exploring these mysteries that haunt the boundaries between history and mythology, between documented facts and carefully constructed founding narratives. The contrast is striking, isn't it? We reach across centuries and continents with casual digital intimacy, sharing our locations and curiosities with strangers, participating in a global conversation that the revolutionaries of 1776 could scarcely have imagined. Yet we reach back toward their moment of creation and find not clarity but contradiction, not resolution but deepening questions. Modern transparency meeting 18th century opacity. Our compulsion to understand everything colliding with their need to obscure certain truths that didn't fit the story they wanted to tell themselves. And so we return to the central question that haunts American history from its very beginning. How did a revolution for liberty emerge from a system built on dispossession, slavery, and empire? How did a movement that declared all men created equal also create a nation where equality remained the privilege of some? How did colonists who resented imperial authority immediately establish their own expanding empire across indigenous lands? The contradictions are not peripheral to American founding, they are its essence, its unresolved DNA. the original sin that every generation must either confront or explain away. Consider the rhetoric of freedom deployed by revolutionaries who owned other human beings. Thomas Jefferson pens the most eloquent defense of human liberty in the English language, while enslaving more than 100 people at Monticello. George Washington commands an army fighting for independence while relying on enslaved labor to maintain his wealth. The dissonance is so profound it almost seems deliberate, as if freedom was always meant to be a bounded category, a privilege rather than a right, something that required others' unfreedom to have meaning. The revolution speaks the language of universal human rights while practicing the reality of hierarchical exclusion. Consider the claims of self-rule deployed by colonists who systematically violated indigenous sovereignty. The revolutionaries complained bitterly about taxation without representation while denying native nations any representation in their political future, despite those nations' prior and continuing claims to the land itself. The Declaration of Independence famously charges King George III with inciting merciless Indian savages against frontier settlements, a phrase that simultaneously dehumanizes indigenous peoples and erases the context in which they were defending their own territories against settler expansion. Self-rule for colonists requires the denial of self-rule for others. Freedom for some requires the dispossession of others. The revolution's territorial ambitions inherit directly from the imperial logic it claims to reject. Consider the declarations of unity deployed by a confederation barely held together by common enemies and temporary expedients. Regional divisions run deep economic differences between northern commerce and southern plantation agriculture. Religious differences between established churches and dissenting sects. Political differences about the proper balance between liberty and order. Wealthy merchants and subsistence farmers, slaveholders and abolitionists, coastal elites and frontier settlers. These groups share little except a desire to be free from British rule, and even that desire is far from universal. Perhaps a third of colonists remain loyal to the crown, another third are neutral or indifferent, and the final third who support independence are themselves divided about what that independence should look like. The unity is performed rather than felt, declared rather than experienced. Historians recognize colonial America as the foundation of modern democracy, capitalism, and empire, a recognition that carries both celebration and critique. The American Revolution establishes precedents for popular sovereignty, constitutional government, and political rights that will echo through subsequent revolutions in France, Haiti, and Latin America. It demonstrates that colonial peoples can successfully challenge imperial power and establish their own governments. It articulates principles of human equality and natural rights that, however imperfectly applied, become ammunition for future movements toward genuine equality. The founding documents and debates create a political tradition that subsequent generations will both invoke and expand. But that same founding also establishes precedents for racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and imperial expansion masked as liberation. It demonstrates that revolutions for freedom can coexist with slavery and genocide, that democracies can restrict the demos to a narrow subset of inhabitants, that republics can be built on profoundly unrepublican foundations of hierarchy and exclusion. The American Revolution creates not one legacy but multiple, often contradictory legacies that future generations will have to navigate, claiming some while disavowing others, celebrating certain aspects while minimizing or forgetting others equally foundational. National identity depends on which stories define the beginning, and from the very start, there is no single beginning but multiple competing beginnings. Is America born in 1619, when the first enslaved Africans arrive in Virginia, establishing the racial slavery that will define American economy and society for centuries? Is America born in 1620, when the Mayflower Compact articulates principles of self-governance and covenant, establishing the myth of Pilgrim Fathers and religious freedom? Is America born in 1763 when British victory in the French and Indian War sets in motion the imperial reforms that provoke colonial resistance? Is America born in 1776 when independence is declared but not yet won? Is America born in 1783 when independence is recognized by treaty? Is America born in 1787 when the Constitution is drafted, or 1788 when it is ratified, or 1789 when the new government actually takes power? Each starting point tells a different story about what America is and what it means. Each includes certain actors and excludes others. Each emphasizes certain values and minimizes others. The question of origin is not merely academic, it determines whose contributions count as founding, whose suffering counts as foundational, whose visions of freedom become definitive. National identity is a choice about which past to claim, and different communities within the nation make different choices based on their different experiences of that past. Moral legitimacy remains contested from the first moments of independence. For those who benefited from the revolution, propertied white men who gained political power and economic opportunity, the founding represents the triumph of liberty over tyranny, the vindication of Enlightenment principles, the birth of a nation dedicated to human freedom. For those excluded from the revolution's benefits, enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, women, the propertyless, the founding represents betrayal, hypocrisy, the continuation of oppression under new management, a promise of freedom that applied to others but not to them. Both perspectives are true simultaneously. Both are part of what America is from the beginning. The documentary record reflects and reinforces these competing perspectives. European colonial records dominate surviving archives, British administrative documents, colonial assembly proceedings, merchant account books, plantation records, military reports. These sources tell the revolution primarily from the perspective of white colonists and British officials, the people who kept systematic written records as part of governing and commerce. Their complaints about British policy, their debates about resistance strategies, their negotiations about constitutional structure, these are exhaustively documented because these were the people with the literacy, resources, and institutional frameworks to create and preserve documents. But this documentary dominance creates profound silences. Indigenous oral histories are suppressed, ignored, or destroyed deliberately in some cases, through neglect and cultural erasure in others. The diplomatic speeches of Indigenous leaders, the strategic considerations that guided their choices during the war, the internal debates within Indigenous communities about how to respond to colonial rebellion, these are largely absent from the archive or are filtered through European interpreters and recorders whose biases shape what is preserved. We know what colonists said about Indigenous peoples, but far less about what Indigenous peoples said about themselves and their circumstances. Patriot accounts clash with loyalist testimonies in ways that reveal how political alignment shapes historical memory. Patriots write the revolution as liberation, as the triumph of freedom over tyranny, as a glorious struggle by virtuous colonists against corrupt British power. Loyalists write the revolution as rebellion, as the breakdown of legitimate authority, as mob violence and vigilante justice dressed up as political philosophy, as the triumph of ambitious demagogues over prudent governance. Both describe the same events, but construct radically different narratives about meaning and morality. And because the Patriots won, their version becomes official history, while loyalist perspectives are marginalized or forgotten, preserved primarily in British archives that Americans rarely consult. Colonial grievances conflict with British administrative records in ways that reveal the unbridgeable gap between imperial and colonial perspectives. From London, the policies that provoke revolution seem reasonable. Britain has just fought an expensive war partially to defend the colonies, has acquired new territory that requires administration and defense, and reasonably expects colonists to contribute to the costs of empire that benefits them. The taxes are actually quite modest by British standards. The regulations designed to bring order to previously haphazard colonial administration. From the colonial perspective, the same policies seem like tyrannical overreach: new taxes, without colonial consent, standing armies as instruments of oppression, restrictions on westward expansion that block colonial ambitions, governance from across an ocean, by officials with no understanding of colonial conditions. Both perspectives are internally logical, but they are incompatible. And no amount of explanation can bridge the gap, because they start from different assumptions about authority, autonomy, and rights. Political bias shapes nearly every surviving document from this period. Patriots create propaganda to justify rebellion and maintain morale. Loyalists create counter-propaganda to defend their allegiance and challenge rebel claims. British officials create reports to justify their policies and explain colonial resistance to skeptical superiors in London. Neutral observers are rare, and even those who attempt objectivity write from particular social positions that shape what they notice and how they interpret it. There are no neutral documents from this period, only documents whose biases we can recognize and attempt to account for in our interpretations. This section must close on the unresolved challenge that will haunt American history. Was the American Revolution a clean break from empire, or its quiet continuation under a new name? Did independence represent the rejection of imperial logic, or merely the transfer of imperial power from British hands to American hands, from a distant monarch to a closer confederation that would itself become an empire, expanding across a continent, displacing indigenous nations, extending slavery, imposing its own form of authority on peoples who had no say in its formation? The revolutionaries claimed to be rejecting empire. They denounced British imperialism, condemned the tyranny of distant rule, celebrated the liberation of colonized peoples. But what they built in the Constitution's provision for territorial expansion, in the Northwest Ordinance's framework for incorporating new lands, in the unstated but understood assumption that the United States would grow westward across indigenous territories, looks remarkably like empire, just with different rhetoric. The revolution against empire becomes an empire of liberty, an expansive republic, a democratic empire. Contradictions embedded in the very names, in the very concept, from the very beginning. Or perhaps this framing itself is too simple. Perhaps the revolution was simultaneously anti-imperial and imperial, simultaneously liberating and oppressive, simultaneously radical and conservative. Perhaps it broke from British Empire while creating American Empire, rejected monarchy while creating a republic that would exercise monarchical power over others, proclaimed liberty while practicing bondage. Perhaps the contradictions are not bugs but features, not problems to be solved, but the actual historical reality of how nations are born in violence and idealism, in hypocrisy and aspiration, in the same moment and the same people, creating legacies that their descendants will spend centuries trying to reconcile or explain. To understand how a revolution for liberty could emerge from systems of oppression, we must first understand the world that produced that contradiction, a world simultaneously more complex and more comprehensible than the simplified narratives we inherit. This is the world of colonial North America before the Revolution, a world that to its inhabitants seemed stable and permanent, ordered by familiar hierarchies, governed by assumptions that felt natural and inevitable. We must resist the temptation to see this world only as a prelude to revolution, must try to see it as contemporaries saw it, as a functional, expanding imperial system that showed no signs of imminent collapse. The Atlantic seaboard stretches from the rocky harbors of New England to the plantation regions of the southern colonies, from the cod fishing villages of Massachusetts to the rice plantations of South Carolina, from Boston's merchant princes to Charleston's planter aristocracy. The geography is not merely backdrop but determinant of economy, culture, and social structure. The rocky soil and shorter growing season of New England produce small farms, fishing fleets, shipbuilding industries, and commercial towns oriented toward trade. The longer growing season and more fertile soil of the middle colonies produce grain exports, diverse immigrant populations, and thriving port cities like Philadelphia and New York that become commercial crossroads. The warmest climate and richest soil of the southern colonies produce tobacco, rice, and indigo for export markets, plantation economies dependent on enslaved labor, and a social structure dominated by a wealthy planter class. But the colonies are connected not just to each other, but to a broader Atlantic world. Ships carry goods, people, diseases, and ideas among Europe, Africa, and the Americas in circuits that link Liverpool to Lagos, to Charleston, to London, in webs of commerce and exploitation. Sugar from Caribbean plantations flows to New England to be distilled into rum. Rum flows to West Africa to purchase enslaved people. Enslaved people flow to Caribbean and southern plantations to produce sugar and tobacco. Tobacco flows to European markets to be consumed by classes that never see the labor that produces it. Everyone is enmeshed in these circuits. Whether they understand them fully or not, the Massachusetts merchant who invests in slave ships, the Virginia planter who borrows from London bankers, the English laborer who smokes Chesapeake tobacco, the African kingdoms that profit from the slave trade even as it devastates their peoples. River systems shape the interior as profoundly as the ocean shapes the coast. The Hudson River connects New York to the Mohawk Valley and the Great Lakes beyond. The Susquehanna River links the Chesapeake to the interior plateaus of Pennsylvania. The Connecticut River opens New England to northern trade routes. These are not just waterways, but highways of commerce and migration, routes along which people, goods, and ideas flow. Boundaries that separate but also connections that join. Control of rivers means control of trade, which means control of wealth, which means control of power. The geography produces the economy, and the economy produces the politics that will eventually produce revolution. But European colonies are not the only powers in North America. Interior trade routes connect colonial settlements to indigenous networks that long predate European arrival and continue to function according to their own logics. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known to the British as the Six Nations, though the name itself reduces their complexity to mere enumeration, maintains diplomatic and military power across a territory stretching from the Mohawk Valley to the Great Lakes. Their confederacy is not primitive or simple, but sophisticated. A political system of checks and balances, consensus decision-making, and careful diplomacy that has maintained peace among member nations and balance with neighboring peoples for generations before Europeans arrived. The Mississippian legacy of Cahokia shapes indigenous land use and governance traditions, even though Cahokia itself has long since been abandoned. The great mound cities of the Mississippi Valley represented complex urban civilizations, agricultural societies with social hierarchies, religious systems, and trade networks that extended across much of the continent. Their decline, driven by environmental changes, disease, warfare, and factors still debated by archaeologists, does not mean indigenous peoples vanished or declined, but that they reorganized, migrated, formed new polities, and adapted to changing circumstances. The peoples European colonists encounter are not remnants of a dead civilization, but inheritors of ancient traditions adapted to new realities. Spanish authority dominates Florida and the Gulf Coast, stretching from Street Augustine to Texas, from the Caribbean to the northern frontiers of New Spain. This is the oldest European colonial presence in what will become the United States, established by conquistadors and missionaries in the 16th century, administered through vice-regal bureaucracies and Franciscan missions, oriented toward Mexico City and Madrid, rather than the Atlantic colonies further north. Spanish colonialism has its own distinct character, more focused on conversion than displacement, more willing to incorporate indigenous peoples into colonial hierarchies, more explicitly racial in its legal categories of identity. The Black legend portrays Spanish cruelty as uniquely barbaric, But this is largely English propaganda designed to justify English colonialism as somehow more benevolent. All European empires in the Americas are built on violence and exploitation. They differ mainly in details and rhetoric. French influence extends through the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley, a thin line of forts, missions, and trading posts connecting Quebec to Louisiana, New France to Nouvelle Orleans. French colonialism in North America is distinctive in its reliance on indigenous alliances, its emphasis on trade rather than settlement, its flexibility in working within indigenous political systems rather than attempting to erase them. The coureurs de bois and voyageurs who travel indigenous trade routes marry into indigenous communities and mediate between French officials and indigenous nations, create hybrid worlds where boundaries between European and native, colonizer and colonized, blur in ways that challenge simple narratives of conquest. But this should not be romanticized. French colonialism is still colonialism, still extractive, still built on assumptions of European superiority and indigenous inferiority, still willing to use violence when trade and alliance prove insufficient. English colonies cluster along the eastern coastline, from Maine to Georgia, 13 separate entities with distinct charters, governments, economies, and social structures. They are not united, they compete for land and trade, dispute boundaries, practice different religions, organize labor differently. Massachusetts is not Virginia. Pennsylvania is not South Carolina. They share a language and a distant monarch, but little else that would predict their eventual confederation. What holds them in the British Empire is not shared identity, but shared subjection to imperial authority, shared participation in Atlantic commerce, shared vulnerability to indigenous resistance and European rival powers. They are colonies of empire, not yet colonies imagining independence. And within these European colonies live the peoples whose labor sustains everything. Indigenous councils govern through consensus and long memory. Political systems that strike Europeans as anarchic because they lack centralized authority and hereditary kingship, but which function effectively according to their own principles. Decisions require unanimity or near unanimity. Leaders lead through persuasion and example rather than coercion. Memory and oral tradition preserve political precedents and diplomatic agreements across generations. These are not simpler forms of government, but different forms, built on different assumptions about authority, community, and the proper relationship between leaders and led. The Haudenosaunee political system, in particular, demonstrates sophistication that Europeans struggle to recognize or respect: the great law of peace. The oral constitution that governs the Confederacy establishes procedures for conflict resolution, protocols for diplomatic relations, mechanisms for incorporating new nations, and frameworks for collective decision-making that require careful negotiation and consensus building. Clan mothers hold significant political power, selecting and deposing chiefs, influencing decisions about war and peace, maintaining the social structures that bind communities together. This is not patriarchy, but a system where women's authority balances men's authority, where different spheres of influence create checks on concentrated power. The Confederacy itself represents an extraordinary political achievement, maintaining peace among formerly warring nations, creating frameworks for mutual defense and collective action, establishing diplomatic protocols recognized and respected across a vast territory. When Benjamin Franklin and other colonial thinkers later seek models for how separate colonies might unite while maintaining autonomy, they will look partly to Haudenosaunee examples, though they will adapt and transform those examples in ways that serve colonial rather than indigenous interests. The influence is real, but also limited and distorted. The colonists take what serves their purposes, while ignoring aspects that might challenge their assumptions about hierarchy, property, and power. Indigenous land use practices reflect sophisticated understanding of ecology and sustainability that Europeans misread as primitive or wasteful. The wilderness that Europeans encounter is not untouched nature, but carefully managed landscape, shaped by controlled burns that create meadows and promote game populations, by selective harvesting that maintains forest health, by seasonal movements that allow ecosystems to recover and regenerate. Indigenous agriculture combines crops in ways that improve soil fertility and maximize yields. The three sisters of corn, beans, and squash planted together create mutually beneficial relationships where corn provides structures for beans to climb, beans fix nitrogen in soil, and squash provides ground cover that retains moisture and suppresses weeds. But European observers, looking for agricultural practices that match their expectations of settled farming with permanent fields and fenced boundaries, see instead mobility and flexibility that they interpret as nomadism or laziness. The fact that indigenous peoples don't stay in one place year-round, don't clear-cut forests for permanent pasture, don't fence and subdivide land into private holdings. These differences are read as evidence that indigenous peoples don't truly use the land and therefore have no legitimate claim to it. The environmental destruction that European agriculture brings, soil exhaustion, deforestation, erosion, loss of biodiversity, is interpreted as improvement, as bringing order and productivity to waste, while indigenous practices that maintain ecological balance are dismissed as primitive failure to exploit resources properly. Colonial governors enforce imperial policy on behalf of distant monarchs, royal appointees whose primary loyalty is to the crown and whose primary concern is maintaining order and extracting revenue. They are not representatives of the colonists, but representatives to the colonists, agents of imperial power embedded in colonial societies, often resented as outsiders even when they are competent and well-meaning. Their position is inherently unstable. They must enforce policies that colonists oppose, while maintaining enough colonial support to govern effectively. The contradiction will become untenable. But for now, it is simply the normal friction of imperial administration. Colonial assemblies negotiate limited autonomy within empire, elected bodies of colonists with power over local taxation and legislation, asserting the rights of Englishmen while acknowledging subordination to Parliament and Crown. They are not democratic in any modern sense. Voters are restricted to property-owning men. Representation is skewed toward coastal elites. Decisions are made by small groups of wealthy merchants and planters, but they are participatory enough to create expectations of self-governance. And those expectations will ultimately prove incompatible with imperial authority. The assemblies are training grounds for the revolution to come, though nobody yet recognizes this. Merchants profit from Atlantic trade networks, buying and selling commodities, extending credit, managing complex transactions across thousands of miles. They are not merely economic actors, but political powers, their wealth translated into influence over assemblies and governors, their networks creating dependencies that bind colonies to empire. A Philadelphia merchant might owe money to London creditors while extending credit to Pennsylvania farmers, sitting simultaneously at multiple points in chains of debt that structure colonial economy. The merchants do not want revolution. Revolution disrupts trade, threatens property, introduces instability. But their economic interests will increasingly conflict with British imperial policies, and that conflict will push them toward reluctant rebellion. Missionaries attempt cultural transformation through religion, Jesuits and Franciscans among Catholics, Congregationalists and Anglicans among Protestants, competing to convert indigenous peoples and colonial settlers alike. They see themselves as saving souls but function as agents of empire, their missions establishing European presence in indigenous territories, their schools teaching European languages and customs, their theological claims providing moral justification for conquest and displacement. Yet some missionaries also document indigenous languages, challenge colonial abuses, and create spaces where indigenous peoples can navigate between traditional and colonial worlds. The missionary encounter is not simple. It is a site of violence and resistance, adaptation and transformation, where power operates but is never absolute. Enslaved laborers sustain plantation economies through coerced violence, their labor producing the tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton that generate colonial wealth. Their bodies defined as property under law, their humanity denied in theory while exploited in practice. Slavery in 18th century North America is becoming increasingly racialized and hereditary, moving from an institution that could include indentured Europeans and occasional paths to freedom toward a system where African ancestry means permanent bondage passed through generations. This is not ancient slavery but modern racial capitalism, where human beings are commodified, where labor is extracted through terror, where the color line organizes society and determines destiny. The enslaved resist in countless ways through work slowdowns and sabotage, through running away, through maintaining African cultural traditions, through occasional violent revolt, but the system is powerful enough to contain most resistance most of the time. Each group operates rationally within inherited worldviews. To see this world as contemporaries saw it requires suspending our knowledge of what comes next, resisting the teleological temptation to see everything as leading to revolution. To Europeans, empire is natural and permanent, the way the world is organized, as inevitable as the seasons. To many colonists, British Empire is not oppression but protection, a framework that provides security against indigenous resistance and European rivals while allowing considerable local autonomy. To indigenous nations, European empires are newcomers to be managed through diplomacy and warfare, temporary disruptions to be outlasted or adapted to, powers to be played against each other to preserve indigenous sovereignty. To enslaved Africans, the colonial world is captivity, but even captivity requires strategies for survival and meaning-making. Social hierarchy is accepted as natural order, divinely sanctioned, essential to social stability. Kings rule by divine right. Property qualifies men for political participation. Masters own servants. Men govern households. Whiteness confers privileges over blackness. Each layer of hierarchy has theological justification, philosophical rationale, practical function. Challenge any layer and you risk the whole structure, which is why challenges are contained, suppressed, or redirected toward acceptable outlets. The hierarchy does not feel like oppression to those who benefit from it. It feels like order, stability, the way things should be. Land is defined as property awaiting improvement, a definition that erases indigenous understandings of land as relationship and responsibility rather than commodity. In European legal theory, unused land is waste, and waste justifies appropriation by those who will improve it through agriculture and settlement. Never mind that indigenous peoples use the land for hunting, gathering, seasonal agriculture, and spiritual practice, because that use doesn't look like European agriculture, it doesn't count as use, and the land is available for claiming. This legal fiction will justify continental expansion, transforming indigenous territories into colonial property through the alchemy of colonial law. But beneath the surface stability, fault lines are growing. European diseases destabilize indigenous populations. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, and other pathogens that native peoples have no immunity to, producing mortality rates that sometimes approach 90%. Social collapse that makes resistance increasingly difficult. The depopulation is so severe that it transforms landscapes. Forests return to former agricultural lands. Wildlife populations rebound without human management. The American wilderness that Europeans encounter is partially a post-apocalyptic environment where indigenous populations have crashed and ecosystems have responded. The demographic catastrophe is not natural but colonial, not inevitable, but a direct consequence of European contact and conquest. Settler land hunger accelerates westward expansion. Small farmers and speculators alike pushing beyond the boundaries that treaties establish, squatting on indigenous lands, creating facts on the ground that imperial officials struggle to contain or legitimize after the fact. The settlers do not see themselves as imperialists, but as seekers of opportunity, as farmers wanting land to support their families, as people exercising what they see as natural rights to unoccupied territory. That the territory is not actually unoccupied is an inconvenient fact they can ignore or rationalize. The hunger for land is insatiable and will be a constant pressure driving expansion regardless of official policy. Colonial autonomy strains against imperial authority in countless small ways that accumulate over decades. Smuggling violates trade regulations. Assemblies resist governors' initiatives. Colonists ignore land policies meant to preserve indigenous territories. Each violation is small. Each conflict is negotiated. Each compromise maintains the system. But the pattern establishes that colonists feel entitled to govern themselves in ways that increasingly conflict with imperial directives. The colonies are learning to function semi-autonomously even while formally subordinate to Crown and Parliament. Slavery hardens quietly into permanence across generations, moving from one labor system, among others, toward the foundational institution of Southern economy and society. The children of enslaved people are enslaved. Manumission becomes rare. The color line becomes the boundary between freedom and bondage. Slavery and race become synonymous in ways they were not in earlier periods when servitude took multiple forms. By the mid-18th century, the plantation South is committed to slavery in ways that make abolition unthinkable within the system. Any challenge to slavery threatens the entire social structure, so slavery must be defended, normalized, made permanent. The world appears orderly and expanding to most white colonists, particularly those with property and political voice. The empire brings prosperity through trade. The colonies grow through immigration and natural increase. The frontier expands westward. Towns become cities. Wealth accumulates. For the beneficiaries of the colonial system, life is getting better. And there is no reason to expect that improvement to stop. Revolution is the last thing on their minds because they are generally satisfied with arrangements that serve their interests. But beneath stability, imbalance grows. The indigenous depopulation and displacement that creates room for colonial expansion also creates resentment and resistance that will eventually require military solutions. The enslaved population that produces colonial wealth also represents a potential threat, an internal enemy that must be controlled through violence and surveillance. The colonial prosperity that seems so robust is built on British credit and protection, creating dependencies that make colonists vulnerable to any shift in British policy. The stability is real but fragile, functional but unsustainable, working well enough for now but containing contradictions that will eventually break it apart. The French and Indian War reshapes North America in ways that contemporaries recognize as significant but cannot fully anticipate. Known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, the conflict began in 1754 with border skirmishes in the Ohio Valley and escalated into a global conflict involving most of the major European powers and their colonial possessions worldwide. In North America, the war sets France and its native allies against Britain and its colonial and native allies in a struggle for control of the continent's interior. The stakes are nothing less than the future shape of North American empire. Will it be French, British, Spanish, or some unimaginable alternative where indigenous nations maintain sovereignty? The war begins with colonial ambitions clashing in the Ohio country, that vast territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, where neither France nor Britain has secure control but both claim authority. Virginia speculators, including a young George Washington, have economic interests in Western lands and want to secure those claims against French encroachment. The French want to maintain their connection between Canada and Louisiana, want to preserve their trading relationships with indigenous nations, want to prevent British expansion that would threaten New France's viability. Indigenous nations in the Ohio country want to maintain their autonomy. playing European powers against each other to preserve space for indigenous sovereignty in a landscape increasingly dominated by colonial empires. Washington leads a Virginia militia expedition into the Ohio country in 1754 that sparks the wider conflict. His attack on a French diplomatic party, an ambiguous encounter where accounts differ about who initiated violence and whether the French were really spies or legitimate diplomats, escalates into wider combat. Washington builds Fort Necessity, but is forced to surrender to superior French forces, signing a document that, in its French version which he cannot read, admits to having assassinated the French commander. The young Virginian returns home in defeat, but the incident has set in motion events that will reshape the continent. The colonial skirmish becomes an imperial war, drawing in regular British and French troops, indigenous allies on multiple sides, and eventually Spain as a late French ally. Britain commits enormous resources to winning the war. William Pitt, Britain's energetic Secretary of State, pursues a global strategy where North American operations are coordinated with campaigns in Europe, the Caribbean, India, and Africa. Britain's superior navy gives it advantages in moving troops and supplies across oceans, in blockading French ports, in threatening French colonies worldwide. Britain's ability to borrow money and sustain debt allows it to finance operations on a scale France cannot match. By 1759, British forces are winning decisive victories, the capture of Fort Niagara that cuts French communications with the interior, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham that leads to Quebec's fall, the surrender of Montreal in 1760 that effectively ends French resistance in North America. Even though the formal treaty waits until 1763, Britain defeats France comprehensively, a victory sealed by the 1763 Treaty of Paris that transfers virtually all French claims in North America to British control. New France becomes British Canada, though Britain will struggle to govern a French Catholic population that doesn't speak English and has no history of British institutions or loyalties. Louisiana is divided, the western portion going to Spain as compensation for Spanish losses in the war, the eastern portion incorporated into British holdings. The French Empire in North America, built over more than a century through exploration, trade, and alliance with indigenous nations, collapses almost overnight. French settlers in Quebec must adapt to British rule. French traders throughout the interior lose their privileged relationships with indigenous partners. French officials, soldiers, and many settlers return to France, leaving behind a transformed continent where British authority now claims territory from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico, from ancient colonies to newly conquered lands that British officials barely understand and have no idea how to administer. But Britain inherits not just territory but massive war debt that threatens to bankrupt the empire. Financing the global conflict has strained British resources to the breaking point. The national debt has nearly doubled during the war, rising from approximately £75 million to over £130 million sterling, an astronomical sum by 18th century standards. Interest payments consume huge portions of government revenue, leaving less for other purposes. British taxpayers, already bearing heavy land taxes and excise duties, are at their limit and resist further increases. The war was fought partially to defend the colonies, British officials note, and the newly won territory primarily benefits colonial interests, so it seems only fair that colonists should contribute to the costs of empire that protects them and to the administration of territories that will enable their expansion. This logic seems unassailable in London, where officials view the war as primarily a colonial affair that metropolitan Britain generously supported. British troops fought and died in North American forests to defend colonial frontiers. British ships maintained naval supremacy that prevented French reinforcements from reaching Canada. British taxpayers funded operations that benefited colonists far more than British residents. And now those same colonists resist contributing to the costs of their own defense, even though British tax rates remain far lower in the colonies than in Britain itself. The ingratitude is staggering from the British perspective, but it looks entirely different from the colonial side. Colonists remember that they fought in the war too, that colonial militias participated in campaigns, that colonial assemblies voted funds for military operations, that colonial merchants supplied troops, that colonial civilians suffered raids by French and Indian forces. The war disrupted trade, brought violence to frontier communities, required sacrifices from colonists who see themselves as having done their part. And the victory that Britain claims credit for brings colonists not the rewards they expected, expanded opportunities for Western settlement, but restrictions that seem to punish their loyalty. The psychological reversal is stunning. From wartime allies sharing sacrifices and celebrating victories together, to post-war subordinates being told they haven't contributed enough and must accept new burdens. British officials prioritize order and fiscal recovery, sensible administrative responses to genuine problems. The newly acquired territories require governance. French-speaking Catholics in Quebec, Indigenous nations whose treaties with France have been nullified by conquest, vast territories whose ownership is disputed or unclear. The war has demonstrated colonial military ineffectiveness and unreliability. Colonial militias performed poorly. Colonial assemblies resisted funding their own defense. Colonial smuggling with the French enemy continued even during the war. The obvious solution is to station regular British troops in North America to defend against continued indigenous resistance, to assert control over new territories, and incidentally, to ensure colonial compliance with imperial policies. And those imperial policies must change. The previous system of salutary neglect, where British officials largely ignored colonial violations of trade laws and allowed considerable colonial autonomy, as long as colonies remained profitable and loyal, no longer serves imperial interests. The war has revealed the costs of loose administration. The new territories require more systematic governance. The debt requires new revenue. What Britain needs is a more rational, centralized, imperial administration, where policies are enforced uniformly, where the colonies contribute financially to their own defense, where the mercantile system operates as designed rather than being undermined by smuggling and corruption. But colonists perceive betrayal after years of wartime sacrifice. They had fought in the war, had suffered casualties, had paid taxes to support military operations, had celebrated British victory as their victory, had imagined that victory would bring new opportunities for westward expansion into the Ohio Valley and beyond. And now they discover that the victory brings not opportunity but restriction, not gratitude but new burdens, not expanded autonomy but tightened control. The psychological shock is profound. Colonists expected reward for their loyalty and contributions. They receive instead a standing army, new taxes, and officials telling them that their previous autonomy was a mistake to be corrected. Indigenous nations face collapsing alliances and rising dispossession as the war's outcome eliminates their carefully maintained diplomatic strategy of playing European powers against each other. The Ohio Valley nations had allied with France to resist British expansion, and that strategy made sense when France and Britain were military rivals of roughly equal strength. But with France eliminated from North America, there is no counterweight to British power, no alternative alliance that might restrain British aggression, no way to maintain sovereignty through diplomacy when military force becomes the only option. Some nations try to continue armed resistance, as in Pontiac's War of 1763, when a confederation of Great Lakes and Ohio Valley peoples attempts to drive the British back from the frontier. Others try to adapt through negotiation, seeking the best terms they can get in treaties that will be violated almost as soon as they are signed. The British respond to Pontiac's War with the proclamation of 1763, an attempt to stabilize the frontier by forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, reserving those lands for indigenous peoples, and requiring that any land transactions be negotiated between indigenous nations and the Crown, rather than between indigenous peoples and individual settlers. From a British imperial perspective, this makes perfect sense. Stabilize the frontier, reduce conflict, prevent the military expenses of constant frontier warfare, regulate settlement so it proceeds in an orderly manner that serves imperial interests. From an indigenous perspective, the proclamation offers temporary protection but no guarantee of permanent sovereignty, and experience suggests that British promises are worth little once British interests change. From a colonial perspective, the proclamation feels like betrayal. Many colonists had fought in the war specifically to gain access to Ohio Valley lands. Land speculators, including George Washington, had invested in Western land claims, expecting to profit from settlement. Settlers were already moving across the mountains, squatting on indigenous lands, creating facts on the ground that the proclamation now declares illegal. The proclamation announces that the British Empire, having just won a war that opened the West to expansion, will now prevent that expansion in order to protect the very peoples whose defeat was supposedly the war's purpose. The absurdity and injustice feel obvious to colonists who wanted the fruits of victory, but receive instead what feels like punishment for their loyalty. Salutary neglect ends abruptly, replaced by assertive imperial administration that transforms colonial political culture. For decades, British officials had mostly left colonial assemblies to govern themselves, enforcing trade regulations lightly, allowing smuggling to flourish, treating colonial resistance to unpopular policies as minor annoyances rather than serious challenges. This neglect was not policy but practice, a combination of British preoccupation with European affairs, the difficulty of governing across 3,000 miles of ocean, and the pragmatic recognition that colonial compliance was easier to maintain through loose control than tight supervision. The colonies learned to function semi-autonomously, developed expectations of self-governance, came to see British interference as illegitimate rather than routine. Now that practice reverses. New taxes impose imperial authority directly through measures like the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765, both designed to raise revenue from the colonies to support British military presence and administration. These are not the first taxes colonists have paid, but they are different in kind. They are internal taxes imposed by Parliament rather than external trade duties. They are designed primarily to raise revenue rather than regulate commerce, and they come with vigorous enforcement mechanisms, including vice admiralty courts without juries that colonists see as threatening their traditional rights. The taxes are modest by British standards. The Stamp Act raised perhaps 1/5 of what similar taxes raised in Britain, but the principle feels dangerous. If Parliament can impose these taxes without colonial consent, what can it not impose? British soldiers occupy colonial cities, quartered in Boston, New York, and other ports, a standing army in peacetime that colonists see as threatening their liberties and bankrupting their economies through the quartering requirements. The soldiers are supposed to defend the colonies, but they feel like an army of occupation, enforcers of policies colonists oppose, daily reminders of their subordination to imperial power. Conflicts between soldiers and civilians become routine disputes over jobs and resources. Cultural clashes between British soldiers and colonial populations. Occasional violence that escalates into riots and shootings. The most famous incident, the Boston Massacre of 1770, leaves 5 colonists dead after British soldiers fire into a crowd, and becomes propaganda gold for patriots who portray it as evidence of British tyranny, even as the actual circumstances remain disputed. Political disagreement becomes militarized as both sides raise the stakes. Colonial protests against the Stamp Act include mob violence against stamp distributors, destruction of their property, forcing them to resign under threat. These are not polite political debates but intimidation campaigns that terrorize officials trying to enforce British law. Britain responds by sending more troops, by threatening harsher punishments, by attempting to make examples of colonial leaders. Each escalation pushes the conflict into more dangerous territory. What begins as political disagreement over taxation and representation evolves into armed confrontation where both sides prepare for violence, even while hoping it can be avoided. Colonists frame their resistance as defense of English liberties, not as rebellion against legitimate authority, but as protection of traditional rights against unconstitutional innovations. They are not revolutionaries, not yet, but conservatives defending established practices against British radicalism that threatens to transform the relationship between colonists and empire. The rhetoric is important because it provides colonists with a way to resist that feels morally justified and legally defensible. They are not traitors but loyal subjects petitioning for redress of grievances. They are not rebels but Englishmen insisting on rights guaranteed by English constitution and tradition. This framing will eventually prove inadequate once armed conflict begins. Claims about defending traditional rights cannot contain the revolutionary momentum. But for now, it allows colonists to resist without admitting that resistance means revolution. Britain frames enforcement as reasonable governance, not tyranny, but the normal functioning of imperial authority that all empires must exercise to maintain order and extract revenue. British officials are genuinely confused by colonial resistance. From their perspective, they are doing nothing unusual or oppressive. All empires tax their colonies. All empires station troops where they are needed. All empires regulate trade to benefit the metropole. The British Empire actually governs more lightly than most empires. Colonists have assemblies and elections and civil liberties that subjects of absolute monarchies can only dream of. The real question is not why Britain is oppressing the colonies, but why the colonies are so ungrateful for the protection and prosperity that British Empire provides. Pamphlets circulate grievances rapidly as colonial printers produce an extraordinary flowering of political literature that creates a shared political culture across colonies that had previously been quite separate. Thomas Paine's Common Sense is only the most famous of thousands of pamphlets, newspaper essays, and broadsides that argue about imperial policy, constitutional principles, natural rights, and the proper relationship between colonies and metropole. The printing press makes political debate possible across distances that would otherwise prevent coordination. Ideas developed in Boston can be read and debated in Charleston within weeks. Arguments made in Philadelphia can inspire responses in Williamsburg. The colonies are talking to each other in unprecedented ways, discovering shared grievances and shared principles, constructing a collective identity as Americans distinct from British. Protest becomes normalized civic action as resistance to British policies shifts from extraordinary to routine, from occasional to ongoing, from marginal to mainstream. Committees of correspondence organize resistance across colonies. Sons of Liberty enforce boycotts of British goods. Crowds assemble to intimidate officials attempting to enforce British policies. What begins as elite resistance merchants and lawyers and planters unhappy about taxes and trade regulations spreads to include artisans, small farmers, even some of the unpropertied who have no formal political voice but participate in crowd actions and boycotts. Political mobilization reaches unprecedented levels as ordinary people involve themselves in debates and actions that were previously reserved for elite men. Violence emerges unpredictably, not as organized warfare, but as spontaneous clashes that neither side fully controls. The Boston Massacre happens when British soldiers respond to harassment by a crowd. The Gaspee Affair happens when Rhode Island colonists burn a British revenue ship. The Boston Tea Party happens when crowds destroy East India Company tea, rather than accept tea taxed by Parliament. These are not battles in any traditional sense, but explosive moments when political conflict tips into destruction and bloodshed. Neither side intends full-scale war, but both sides are preparing for it. organizing militias and military supplies, training soldiers and developing battle plans, moving toward confrontation, even while hoping negotiation might still resolve the crisis. The sense of irreversibility grows quietly, accumulating through dozens of small steps, where each compromise fails, and each attempt at reconciliation makes the breach worse rather than healing it. Parliament repeals the Stamp Act but passes the Declaratory Act asserting absolute parliamentary sovereignty over the colonies. Parliament repeals most townshend duties but keeps the tax on tea as a principle. The Continental Congress petitions for reconciliation but also prepares for war. King George III declares the colonies in rebellion but offers pardons to those who submit. Each gesture toward compromise is undermined by assertions of authority or resistance that make compromise impossible. By 1775, both sides are committed to positions they cannot retreat from without admitting defeat. The tipping point is already past, even though nobody has acknowledged it yet. The Stamp Act provokes widespread resistance that shocks British officials who expected colonial compliance, or at least manageable opposition. Protests erupt across the colonies almost immediately after the Act's passage in 1765, with an intensity and coordination that surprises both colonial and British observers. Stamp distributors, the colonial officials appointed to sell the stamped paper required for legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, and other printed materials find themselves targets of organized intimidation. They are hanged in effigy from liberty trees in Boston, New York, and other cities, their effigies labeled with accusations of tyranny and treason. Mobs destroy their property, ransack their homes, threaten their families. In Boston, a mob attacks Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house, destroying furniture, stealing valuables, ripping apart the building itself, in fury that combines political resistance with class resentment against wealthy officials who profit from enforcing imperial policies at colonial expense. The violence is shocking not just in its intensity but in its organization and symbolic sophistication. The crowds are not random mobs but organized groups, the Sons of Liberty, committees of correspondence, artisan organizations that coordinate actions across colonies, share information about tactics and targets, create shared language and symbols of resistance. The Liberty Tree becomes a recurring motif, a sacred space where patriots gather and opponents are ritually condemned. The cry, "No taxation without representation," becomes a slogan that crystallizes colonial grievances into a simple constitutional principle. The coordinated nature of resistance suggests that opposition to the Stamp Act is not spontaneous anger but organized political movement with leadership, strategy, and clear objectives. British officials respond with confusion and frustration. They genuinely do not understand why colonists are so opposed to taxes that seem modest and reasonable. The Stamp Act tax rates are far lower than comparable taxes in Britain. The revenue is earmarked for colonial defense, not extracted for metropolitan benefit. The stamps are required for legal and commercial transactions that colonists would undertake anyway, so compliance should be routine. Why do colonists see tyranny where British officials see routine imperial administration? Why do they resist violently what should be accepted peacefully? The cultural and political gap between British and colonial perspectives yawns so wide that each side struggles to comprehend the other's position. But repeal deepens mistrust rather than reconciliation. When Parliament repeals the Stamp Act in 1766, colonists celebrate as a victory for their principles and their resistance tactics. They believe they have demonstrated that British authority can be successfully resisted, that popular mobilization works, that determination can defeat imperial power. The celebration includes illuminations, bonfires, toasts to liberty, and self-congratulation about having defended English rights against tyrannical innovation. But Parliament couples repeal with the Declaratory Act, which asserts that Parliament has absolute power to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, a claim to unlimited sovereignty that makes clear that repeal is a tactical retreat, not an admission of error, not a recognition of colonial rights, but merely a temporary backing down from a policy that proved too costly to enforce. From Parliament's perspective, the Declaratory Act is essential to maintaining imperial authority. They cannot repeal the Stamp Act without also asserting their right to tax, because otherwise repeal would look like surrendering to mob violence, admitting that colonial resistance can overturn parliamentary legislation. The Declaratory Act preserves the principal Parliament's sovereignty over the colonies, even while backing away from the practice actually taxing the colonies. It's a face-saving measure that British politicians need to maintain their credibility at home and their authority abroad. From the colonial perspective, the message is ominous and insulting. Parliament claims absolute power over colonial lives and property, power to legislate in all cases whatsoever, power limited by nothing except parliamentary will. The claim goes far beyond taxation to encompass every aspect of colonial governance. Parliament could abolish colonial assemblies, could revoke colonial charters, could impose any law it chooses, regardless of colonial interests or consent. And having asserted this unlimited power, Parliament demonstrates its willingness to back down only when resistance makes enforcement impossible. The lesson colonists draw is not gratitude for repeal, but understanding that only resistance works, that British authorities respect force but not petitions, that the only way to defend colonial rights is through organized defiance. The Townshend Acts reignite protests within 2 years, imposing new taxes on imports like tea, glass, lead, paint, and paper goods that colonists cannot produce themselves and must import from Britain. The acts are designed by Charles Townshend, Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, to raise revenue while avoiding the political mistakes of the Stamp Act. These are external taxes on imports rather than internal taxes on transactions, collected at ports rather than requiring stamps throughout the colonies, and therefore supposedly less objectionable to colonists who would claim to oppose the Stamp Act's internal taxes specifically. The revenue will be used to pay colonial governors and judges directly, making them independent of colonial assemblies' power over salaries, breaking the financial leverage that assemblies use to influence royal officials. But colonists see through the distinction between internal and external taxes, recognizing it as a technicality that doesn't address their fundamental objection: taxation without representation. The Townshend Acts violate the same principle as the Stamp Act, just through different mechanisms. And the plan to pay governors and judges from customs revenue rather than assembly appropriations threatens colonial political influence, making royal officials independent of the local populations they govern, accountable only to London, free to enforce unpopular policies without facing consequences from colonial assemblies. Street confrontations escalate toward bloodshed as the military occupation of Boston creates constant friction. British soldiers are poorly paid and often moonlight for civilian employment, taking jobs that Boston workers want. Cultural differences create resentment. British soldiers are often Irish or Scottish, speaking with accents and practicing customs that Boston's English Protestant population views with suspicion or contempt. Crowds harass soldiers. Soldiers respond with threats or occasional violence. The situation is explosive, and on the 5th of March, 1770, it explodes. British soldiers fire into a crowd outside the custom house, killing 5 civilians. Whether the soldiers feared for their lives or simply lost discipline remains disputed. Patriots quickly label the incident a massacre and publicize it through Paul Revere's famous engraving, which depicts the soldiers firing on command into a peaceful crowd rather than responding to provocation from a threatening mob. Each compromise worsens suspicion rather than building trust. The partial repeal of Townshend duties leaves the tea tax in place as a matter of principle, a declaration that Parliament retains its right to tax even as it backs away from exercising that right fully. Colonists see this as evidence that British officials have learned nothing, that they care more about asserting authority than about maintaining colonial loyalty. British officials see colonial intransigence as evidence that the colonists are unreasonable, that they will never be satisfied with any compromise. That firm authority rather than accommodation is the only way to maintain imperial order. The question of who fired first at Lexington on the 19th of April 1775 remains unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, lost in the chaos and propaganda of revolution's opening moment. British forces march from Boston to seize colonial military supplies at Concord, and colonial militias gather to resist. At Lexington Green, as dawn breaks, British troops encounter a small militia company. Someone fires a shot, a British soldier, a militia member. An accidental discharge, a deliberate provocation. Nobody knows with certainty. The shot heard round the world remains mysterious in the most literal sense. Each side blames the other. Witnesses contradict each other. The fog of war is dense even for an event that everyone recognized as historically significant from the moment it happened. But the mystery of Lexington is also a metaphor for the larger mystery of revolution's origins. How much of the revolution was planned, and how much was accidental? Did patriot leaders deliberately orchestrate a march toward independence, manipulating events and public opinion to make armed conflict inevitable? Or did revolution emerge from a series of miscalculations and overreactions where neither side wanted war, but couldn't find a way to avoid it? The truth is probably somewhere between intention and accident, agency and structure, where individuals make choices within constraints they don't fully control, where the momentum of events pushes them toward destinations they didn't consciously choose. Enslaved people weigh British promises against colonial hypocrisy in calculations, where every option is dangerous and certainty is impossible. When the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issues a proclamation in November 1775, offering freedom to enslaved people who flee their rebel masters and join British forces, hundreds and eventually thousands respond. For them, British promises of freedom, however dubious and self-interested, are preferable to patriot rhetoric about liberty that explicitly excludes them from its benefits. Thomas Jefferson complains about British incitement of enslaved people, while owning more than 100 people himself, blind to the hypocrisy that makes British offers appealing. But British promises prove unreliable. Some black loyalists do gain freedom and eventual resettlement in Nova Scotia or Sierra Leone. Others are abandoned when British forces evacuate. Still others are returned to slavery when military necessity makes previous promises inconvenient. The revolution is not about black freedom. It is about white colonists' freedom, and enslaved people are pawns in that conflict, their hopes and survival contingent on a war being fought for principles that deliberately exclude them. Some enslaved people make different calculations, supporting the patriots in hope that revolutionary ideals might eventually extend to them, or simply staying put because the risks of flight outweigh the uncertain benefits. None of their options are good. All require gambling with their lives and their families' lives in a conflict where their interests are at best secondary. Indigenous nations choose between survival and annihilation in contexts where neutrality is impossible and all alliances are potentially fatal. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy fractures over the question of which side to support, with Oneida and Tuscarora nations generally supporting the Americans while Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga generally support the British. The decision is pragmatic rather than ideological. Which side is more likely to protect indigenous sovereignty? Which side is less threatening to indigenous lands? The British at least attempt to restrain settler expansion through policies like the Proclamation of 1763, while colonial governments show no inclination to respect indigenous boundaries. But British military weakness makes their promises hollow. By 1779, when General Sullivan's Continental Army campaign burns 40 Haudenosaunee towns and destroys crops and orchards throughout Iroquois, it becomes clear that American victory will mean indigenous dispossession, regardless of which side indigenous nations chose during the war. Loyalists face dispossession and exile for choices that, from their perspective, were entirely rational and even honorable. Remaining loyal to the British Crown was not treason but adherence to oaths of allegiance, obedience to legitimate authority, preference for stability over chaos. But in the revolutionary context, loyalty becomes disloyalty, patriotism becomes treason, lawful behavior becomes punishable offense. Loyalist property is confiscated by state governments eager for revenue and willing to punish political enemies. Loyalist families are intimidated, beaten, driven from communities where they had lived for generations. After British defeat, tens of thousands of Loyalists flee to Canada, Britain, or the Caribbean, becoming refugees from a revolution they opposed, exiles from places they considered home. The human cost is profound but rarely centered in revolutionary narratives that prefer to celebrate military heroes and founding fathers over acknowledging the violence, displacement, and loss that revolution entailed for those on its losing sides. How many enslaved people died in the conflict, whether fighting for British forces, fleeing to them, caught in war's chaos, or executed by patriot masters for disloyalty? How many Indigenous people died defending their lands or fleeing American armies? How many Loyalists lost everything for their political allegiance? The numbers are uncertain because these were not the people who kept records or whose deaths mattered to the governments that emerged victorious. But they were people, real individuals with hopes and fears, families and communities, lives that ended or were destroyed in revolution's violence. Armed conflict spreads beyond political control as war's logic replaces politics' logic. Once shooting begins, once casualties mount, once atrocities are committed by both sides, reconciliation becomes psychologically impossible. How can you negotiate with people who have killed your neighbors? How can you compromise with those you have branded enemies of liberty or rebels against law? The war takes on its own momentum, sustained by fury and grief and the need to justify the sacrifices already made. Soldiers who endure Valley Forge's privations or Crown forces who serve in brutal frontier campaigns cannot accept that their suffering was for nothing, so they must continue fighting, must pursue total victory rather than negotiated peace. Independence transforms from option to necessity, from radical position to only position, not because everyone initially wanted it, but because the alternatives have been foreclosed by violence. In 1774, most colonists wanted reconciliation with Britain, a restoration of the colonial autonomy they had enjoyed before 1763, recognition of their rights as Englishmen within empire. By 1776, after a year of war and British rejection of all petitions for redress, reconciliation seems impossible, and independence becomes not an ideological choice but a practical necessity. The Declaration of Independence justifies a separation that has already occurred in practice, providing legal and philosophical rationale for a split that military conflict has made inevitable. The point of no return is not a single moment, but an accumulation of moments where each step made the next step more likely and eventually unavoidable. Taxation led to protest. Protest led to enforcement. Enforcement led to resistance. Resistance led to repression. Repression led to violence. Violence led to war. War led to independence. Each step seemed like a response to the previous step rather than a deliberate choice. Each escalation appeared to be the other side's fault. Each compromise failure made the next compromise less likely. Neither side wanted the outcome they got. Britain didn't want to lose the colonies. Colonists didn't initially want independence, but both sides made choices that produced that outcome anyway. The tragedy of the American Revolution, if it is a tragedy, is that it was avoidable at many points yet became inevitable through the accumulation of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time but collectively created an outcome nobody intended. Independence is formally achieved when the Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognizes the United States as a sovereign nation with boundaries stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to Spanish Florida. Britain acknowledges its former colonies as independent, agrees to withdraw its troops, grants territorial claims that the Continental Congress demanded. By the formal markers of international relations, the revolution has succeeded completely. A new nation exists where 13 separate colonies had been. Sovereignty has been transferred from a distant monarch to governments controlled by Americans. Empire has been rejected, self-rule established, independence secured. A new constitutional framework emerges, though not immediately and not without difficulty. The Articles of Confederation govern during the war and immediate post-war period, establishing a weak central government that can coordinate military action and foreign relations, but has little power to tax, regulate commerce, or enforce its decisions on resistant states. The Articles reflect revolutionary suspicion of centralized authority, but they prove inadequate to the needs of a nation that must pay war debts, regulate trade, manage Western territories, and present a unified face to European powers. By 1787, the Constitutional Convention proposes a stronger national government with expanded powers, attempting to balance the need for effective governance against revolutionary commitments to limited government and popular sovereignty. The Constitution itself is a document of compromises that embed revolutionary contradictions permanently into American political structure. The 3/5 compromise counts enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation, giving slave states additional political power based on their enslaved populations while denying enslaved people any political voice. The Constitution protects the slave trade for 20 years, forbidding Congress from banning it before 1808. The Fugitive Slave Clause requires free states to return escaped slaves to owners, making the entire nation complicit in maintaining slavery. These are not peripheral compromises but foundational ones, evidence that the Constitution prioritizes union over principle, establishing a framework that can contain both slavery and freedom, that can proclaim equality while practicing hierarchy, that can celebrate liberty while accepting bondage. Empire is publicly rejected in revolutionary rhetoric that denounces British imperialism, celebrates colonial liberation, and promises a republic founded on consent rather than conquest. The revolutionaries see themselves as anti-imperial, as having broken from the logic of empire to establish something new, a government based on popular sovereignty, a nation that expands through incorporation of new states as equals, rather than governance of colonies as subjects, a political order that will spread freedom rather than imposing subordination. The rhetoric is genuine even if the reality will diverge from it. The revolutionaries truly believe they are doing something different, creating something better, rejecting the imperial logic they fought against. But what actually emerges looks remarkably like empire by any other name. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 establishes a framework for territorial governance and eventual statehood that will guide American expansion across the continent. Territories will be governed first as colonies ruled by federally appointed officials without representative institutions before eventually becoming states equal to the original 13. This is literally colonialism, just with a promise of eventual equality that distinguishes it from British imperialism. The Constitution grants Congress power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States, language that treats Western lands as property to be, governed rather than as sovereign territories of indigenous nations. Westward territorial growth that requires eliminating indigenous political independence and territorial claims. The revolution does not resolve but intensifies conflicts over indigenous lands. During the war, most indigenous nations supported Britain in hope of preserving their territories against colonial expansion. After Britain's defeat, they have no European ally to balance American power, no alternative to negotiating from weakness with a government committed to westward expansion and unwilling to recognize indigenous sovereignty as anything more than temporary inconvenience. The pattern that emerges is one of treaty-making followed by treaty violation, negotiation followed by military conquest, promises followed by betrayal. The United States negotiates treaties with indigenous nations, recognizing them as sovereign entities with territorial claims. Then settlers violate those treaties by squatting on indigenous lands, and state and federal governments either cannot or will not remove the illegal settlers. Instead, the government negotiates new treaties that recognize the new facts on the ground, taking more indigenous land in exchange for promises of future respect for boundaries. The cycle repeats: treaty, violation, new treaty. Repeat until indigenous nations are pushed west across the Mississippi or confined to tiny remnants of their former territories. Revolutionary unity dissolves quickly after independence is achieved. The wartime alliance of diverse colonial interests, merchants and planters, artisans and farmers, slaveholders and abolitionists, begins fracturing as soon as there is no common enemy to unite against. Regional tensions that war had suppressed re-emerge. Economic conflicts between states over commerce and debt become acute. Political conflicts over the proper balance between federal and state power, between democracy and order, between liberty and authority, produce fierce debates and eventually partisan divisions. The first party system emerges during the 1792, with Federalists supporting stronger central government and closer ties to Britain, while Democratic Republicans support more limited federal power and closer ties to France. Moral clarity fractures along racial and economic lines, as the nation must confront the contradiction between revolutionary principles and revolutionary practices. Northern states begin gradual abolition of slavery during and after the Revolution, motivated by a combination of ideological conviction, economic calculation, and moral unease about the hypocrisy of slaveholding revolutionaries. But Southern states do not, doubling down on slavery as essential to their economy and social order, developing ideological defenses of slavery as a positive good rather than a necessary evil. The sectional divide over slavery that will eventually produce civil war is established during the Revolution and its immediate aftermath, when the nation has the opportunity to eliminate slavery but chooses instead to compromise, to defer, to hope that time will somehow solve the problem without requiring difficult choices. Some historians frame the revolution as radical democracy, emphasizing its unprecedented expansion of political participation, its articulation of popular sovereignty and natural rights, its challenge to hierarchical authority and hereditary privilege. They point to state constitutions that expand voting rights beyond previous property qualifications, to rhetoric about equality that subsequent movements will use to challenge various forms of domination, to the creation of republican institutions that make governments accountable to citizens in ways that monarchies never were. Historians like Gordon Wood argue that the revolution fundamentally transformed American society, creating a new political culture where common people expected to participate in governance, where deference to social superiors eroded, where democratic values spread far beyond the formal political sphere into social relations, religious organizations, and cultural practices. The revolution established principles that exceeded its practices and created pressure to extend those principles to excluded groups. When the Declaration of Independence proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, it establishes a standard that can be invoked by those denied equality and rights. Enslaved people and free Black Americans would quote revolutionary language in their freedom petitions and abolitionist arguments. Women would invoke revolutionary principles in demanding political rights and social equality. Workers would use revolutionary rhetoric about tyranny and consent to challenge employer authority and demand economic justice. Indigenous peoples would point to revolutionary declarations about sovereignty and self-determination to resist dispossession and assert their own rights to liberty and self-rule. The revolution may not have achieved genuine equality, but it established principles that made inequality harder to justify philosophically and gave marginalized groups ideological weapons for challenging their exclusion. Moreover, The revolution did produce real changes in political participation and social relations, even if those changes were limited and incomplete. Voting requirements were relaxed in some states, expanding the electorate beyond the narrow class of wealthy property owners. New state constitutions included bills of rights that protected individual liberties against government overreach. Social deference declined as Americans increasingly questioned whether birth or wealth entitled some to govern others. Religious disestablishment separated church and state in most states, ending government support for particular denominations. Primogeniture and entail were abolished, preventing the concentration of land in aristocratic families across generations. These were not revolutionary in creating equality, but they moved American society in more democratic directions, establishing trajectories that subsequent generations would continue even if they also faced resistance and reversal. Other historians frame the revolution as elite power transfer, emphasizing that the revolution primarily benefited wealthy colonists who replaced British officials with themselves, maintained systems of economic and racial hierarchy, and constructed a constitution that protected property over democracy and limited popular power through various checks on majority rule. They point to the Constitution's anti-democratic features, the Senate that gave small states equal representation with large states, the Electoral College that interposed elites between voters and presidential selection, the limited franchise that restricted voting to property-owning white men, the protection of slavery through clauses that counted enslaved people for representation while denying them rights, the Fugitive Slave Clause that made all states complicit in maintaining slavery. Historians like Woody Holton and Gary Nash emphasize that common people and marginalized groups often had more radical visions for the revolution than elite founders were willing to accept. The popular movements pushed for economic democracy and social equality that wealthy revolutionaries resisted and contained. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 demonstrates how elite revolutionaries deliberately constructed institutions to limit democracy and protect property. The debates in Philadelphia reveal that many founders feared democracy as mob rule, worried that popular majorities might threaten property rights through redistribution or debt relief. Designed the Constitution with multiple checks on popular power. The Senate, appointed by state legislatures rather than elected by voters, was meant to provide a stabilizing elite voice against popular passions. The presidency, with its unitary executive authority, was meant to provide energy and decisiveness that democratic assemblies supposedly lacked. The Supreme Court, with lifetime appointments, was meant to insulate legal interpretation from popular pressure. The entire system of separation of powers and checks and balances was designed to prevent any faction, including popular majorities, from dominating government and threatening property or stability. The ratification debates of 1787 to 1788 revealed deep divisions about what the revolution meant and what kind of government should emerge from it. Federalists supporting the Constitution argued for stronger national government, effective administration, protection of property rights, and integration into Atlantic commercial networks. Anti-Federalists opposing the Constitution argued for more democratic state governments, protection of local autonomy, concern about concentrated power, recreating the tyranny they had just overthrown, and skepticism about elites who seemed more interested in wealth and power than liberty and equality. The Anti-Federalists lost the ratification fight, but their concerns proved prescient. The national government did grow more powerful, did become more distant from ordinary citizens, did serve elite commercial and financial interests in ways that often conflicted with popular will. Slavery's persistence reveals the revolution's limited radicalism most clearly. Northern states did begin gradual abolition during and after the revolution, but the process was slow and incomplete. Gradual abolition meant that children born to enslaved parents after certain dates would become free at adulthood. But those already enslaved remained in bondage, and even those born free had to serve years of unpaid labor before gaining liberty. The process took decades. States like New York didn't complete abolition until the 820 seconds. And Northern abolition was facilitated by slavery's marginal economic importance in the North. By the ability to abolish slavery without fundamentally restructuring Northern economy or society, by the relatively small enslaved populations that could be freed without threatening white numerical or political dominance. Southern states did not abolish slavery because slavery was central to Southern economy and society in ways it wasn't in the North. Tobacco, rice, and indigo production depended on enslaved labor. Plantation wealth depended on enslaved property. Southern social hierarchy depended on racial subordination. To abolish slavery would require economic transformation that Southern elites had no interest in pursuing, social revolution that threatened their wealth and power, racial equality that they viewed as dangerous and impossible. Some Southern founders, like Jefferson, expressed moral unease about slavery and hoped it might eventually die out naturally, but they were unwilling to take steps to end it and often increased their own slaveholding even while lamenting slavery's evils. The gap between anti-slavery sentiment and anti-slavery action reveals how revolutionary principles could be acknowledged without being acted upon, when action would require genuine sacrifice. Still other historians frame the revolution as an unfinished experiment, acknowledging both its radical and conservative aspects, its simultaneous expansion and limitation of freedom, its creation of principles that exceeded its practices and generated conflicts that continue into our present. Historians like Jill Lepore and Alan Taylor emphasize that the revolution established ideals it did not fulfill, but gave Americans language and institutions through which to demand fulfillment. All men are created equal was a lie when written women were excluded, enslaved people were denied humanity. Indigenous peoples were not recognized as part of the political community the Declaration imagined, but it was a productive lie. A lie that created pressure for truth, that gave excluded groups rhetorical ammunition for challenging their exclusion from equality's promises, that made defenders of inequality justify their positions against revolutionary principles rather than simply taking inequality for granted as natural and eternal. The revolution created a dynamic political culture where founding principles remained available for reinterpretation and extension. Each generation could return to revolutionary sources and find resources for contemporary struggles. Abolitionists quoted the Declaration of Independence and revolutionary rhetoric about natural rights. Suffragists invoked revolutionary principles about consent of the governed to demand women's political participation. Labor organizers used revolutionary language about tyranny and resistance to challenge industrial capitalism's inequalities. Civil rights activists presented their movement as completing the revolution, fulfilling promises that founders made but didn't keep. The revolution's incompleteness became its most important legacy, the gap between ideals and reality that required ongoing struggle to close, the principles that exceeded practices and authorized future demands for greater democracy and equality. Founding contradictions embed themselves permanently into American national identity and political culture, becoming not problems to be solved, but permanent features of American democracy that each generation must navigate. The United States is born both free and unfree, equal and hierarchical, democratic and oligarchic, liberating and oppressive. Every generation inherits these contradictions and must decide how to respond by embracing some aspects and rejecting others, by attempting to extend revolutionary principles to previously excluded groups, by defending existing hierarchies as consistent with founding intent, by reimagining what the revolution meant and what the nation should become. American history is the story of these contradictions, working themselves out through politics and culture, law and social movements, violence and reform, expansion and inclusion, backlash and resistance. The Constitution itself embodies these contradictions in its very structure and language. It begins with, "We the people," but leaves undefined who counts as the people. White men, certainly. But what about women, the enslaved, the propertyless, indigenous nations. The ambiguity is not accidental but deliberate, allowing different groups to claim inclusion while enabling their exclusion in practice. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech and religion, but those protections apply unevenly, extended fully to white property-owning men, while applied selectively or denied entirely to others. The constitutional promises of liberty and equality exist alongside constitutional protections for slavery and property, creating legal and moral tensions that will require civil war and ongoing struggle to address. The Bill of Rights, added to the Constitution in 1791 to address anti-federalist concerns about federal power, both expands liberty and limits it. The amendments protect individual rights against government overreach, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from unreasonable searches, right to trial by jury. These are genuine protections that matter enormously to those who possess them, but they don't extend equally to everyone. States continue to regulate speech and religion in ways that discriminate against minorities. Enslaved people have no rights that federal or state governments are bound to respect. Indigenous nations are not recognized as possessing the rights that the Bill of Rights protects. The rights are real but bounded, applicable to some but not all, expansive in principle but limited in practice. Silence shapes national memory as much as what is remembered and celebrated. The revolutionary narrative that emerges focuses on founding fathers and battlefield heroism, on Continental Congress debates and Declaration of Independence signing, on Valley Forge suffering and Yorktown triumph. This is the story told in textbooks and commemorated in monuments, the myth that defines American identity. But it is a selective memory that foregrounds certain actors and marginalizes or erases others. Where are the loyalists in revolutionary memory? Mostly forgotten or dismissed as traitors, though they were roughly a third of the colonial population and had rational reasons for their allegiance. Where are the enslaved, people who fought for both sides? Marginalized in narratives that celebrate freedom while minimizing slavery's centrality to American founding. Where are the indigenous nations whose lands the revolution was partially fought to acquire, present mainly as obstacles or threats, rarely as peoples with their own histories and perspectives, their own valid reasons for the choices they made? Where are the women who participated in boycotts and maintained farms and businesses and supported revolutionary causes? Acknowledged sometimes but rarely centered, their contributions framed as supporting rather than constituting revolutionary action. The silences are not accidental but functional. To celebrate revolutionary principles while acknowledging revolutionary practices requires either hypocrisy or uncomfortable reckoning. American national identity has generally chosen the former, constructing a founding narrative that emphasizes liberation and minimizes oppression, that celebrates democracy while understating exclusion, that makes the revolution into a morally simple story of good versus evil, when the reality was far more complex and troubling. The silences allow Americans to inherit revolutionary principles without inheriting revolutionary guilt, to claim the founders' legacy without confronting their choices, to celebrate freedom without acknowledging its limits. The excluded and displaced and enslaved left traces in documents and archaeological sites, in oral traditions and family memories, in landscapes scarred by violence, in legal structures that persist long after their original justifications are forgotten. Their stories can be recovered, partially and imperfectly, by historians willing to look beyond the official narrative and ask whose experiences and perspectives have been marginalized or ignored. The recovery is important not to destroy American identity but to complicate it, to create a national story capacious enough to include everyone who was present at the founding, not just those who the founding benefited. Return with me now to where we began, to the burned towns and abandoned estates, to the displaced villages and empty encampments, to the landscape of 1783 where victory sits uneasily alongside loss, where independence achieved coexists with promises broken, where the founding of a nation means the destruction of worlds. The smoke has cleared, but the questions remain. hovering in the air like ghosts unwilling to be dismissed. What can history restore of what was destroyed? Can the historical record resurrect the indigenous towns systematically burned in revolutionary campaigns, the communities scattered across a continent? Can documents and artifacts and archaeological excavations recover the lost worlds of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy at its height, before fracture and dispossession? Can we truly understand what was lost when we can only see remnants, when the victors wrote the history and the defeated left mainly silences? Can scholarship reanimate the lives of the enslaved who navigated revolution's chaos, who weighed impossible choices between British promises and patriot rhetoric, who survived or didn't survive war's violence and dislocation? Can we grasp their hopes and fears, their calculations and dreams, when they rarely appear in the archive except as property, when their voices are mostly mediated through owners' accounts or filtered through abolitionist narratives that serve later purposes? The enslaved made history, but history has difficulty seeing them except as objects rather than subjects, victims rather than actors, backdrop rather than participants in their own stories. Can we recover the loyalist perspective, understand the revolution from the viewpoint of those who opposed it and were punished for their opposition? They believed they were defending law against chaos, legitimacy against rebellion, prudent governance against mob rule. They were wrong by history's verdict. The victors proved them wrong by winning, but wrong is not the same as incomprehensible. Yet we struggle to take loyalist concerns seriously when revolutionary mythology has so thoroughly cast them as villains or fools, when American national identity requires that independence was obviously right and opposition to it obviously wrong. The answer is that history cannot fully restore what was destroyed, cannot make whole what was shattered, cannot retrieve what was lost or silenced. The archive has limits, evidence has gaps, memory fades and becomes distorted. Some losses are permanent, some erasures cannot be undone, some silences cannot be made to speak no matter how carefully we listen. We can glimpse fragments, recover pieces, construct partial accounts that acknowledge what we cannot know as much as what we can know. But we cannot resurrect lost worlds or experience the past as its people experienced it. This is the tragedy that haunts American founding, not just that it involved violence and oppression, though it did, but that the violence and oppression have become difficult to fully see and acknowledge because they contradict the founding mythology that Americans constructed to give the nation meaning and purpose. The revolution for liberty required denying liberty to others. The establishment of democracy required excluding most people from the demos. The creation of the United States required destroying indigenous sovereignty and perpetuating racial slavery. These are not peripheral facts about American founding, but central facts, not unfortunate compromises, but founding conditions. Lives were erased, the indigenous peoples displaced and dispossessed, the enslaved who remained in bondage despite revolutionary rhetoric, the loyalists exiled for their political allegiance. These were not collateral damage, but necessary consequences of the kind of revolution that occurred, the kind of nation that emerged. American independence required that these lives be erased, their claims rejected, their presence eliminated or subordinated. The founding depended on their exclusion. Worlds were displaced, the indigenous political and cultural systems that organized space and social relations before European invasion, the African kinship networks and spiritual traditions that slavery attempted to destroy, the loyalist communities that chose continued connection to British Empire. These worlds didn't simply vanish. They were destroyed deliberately, systematically, through policies and violence that revolutionaries justified as necessary for freedom and progress. The destruction was not incidental to the founding, but its condition, not a failure to live up to revolutionary ideals, but the enabling of those ideals for some through their denial to others. Futures were foreclosed, the potential histories that were prevented by revolution's trajectory. What if indigenous sovereignty had been genuinely recognized and territorial integrity protected? What if slavery had been abolished during or immediately after the revolution when northern states demonstrated it was possible? What if loyalists had been accommodated within the new nation rather than expelled or terrorized? What if women had gained political rights alongside propertied men? These alternate histories were not impossible, they simply didn't happen because the revolution followed other paths, made other choices, established precedents that would be difficult to challenge or overturn. These foreclosed futures haunt American history as possibilities that might have been, roads not taken, choices that could have been made differently. They suggest that the revolution was not inevitable in its outcomes, that a different American founding was possible, even if the actual founding established structures and precedents that made alternatives increasingly difficult to imagine as time passed. The haunting is productive. It prevents us from accepting the founding as natural or inevitable, keeps open the possibility that things could have been otherwise, and therefore could still become otherwise through deliberate political action and social change. Somewhere between the freedom that was declared in Philadelphia and the freedom that was delayed for the enslaved and the dispossessed, a nation learned both how to remember and how to forget. It learned to remember revolutionary principles while forgetting revolutionary practices, to celebrate founding virtues while minimizing founding crimes, to construct a usable past that inspires rather than troubles, that creates national unity rather than forcing difficult reckonings. The forgetting was not accidental but necessary for the kind of national identity Americans constructed, for the myths that hold the nation together across deep divisions. But forgetting has costs. What is forgotten does not disappear, it returns as unresolved trauma, as persistent injustice, as contradictions that keep erupting into politics and culture, as debts that compound across generations until they can no longer be ignored. The enslaved were freed eventually, but slavery's legacies persist in racial inequality and systemic discrimination. Indigenous sovereignty was violated repeatedly, and those violations created legal and moral debts that remain unpaid and perhaps unpayable. The revolution's contradictions were not resolved but deferred, passed to subsequent generations who inherit both revolutionary ideals and revolutionary hypocrisies, both the promise and the betrayal. American national identity emerges through this selective remembrance, through choosing which founding stories to tell and which to minimize, which founders to celebrate and which to forget, which principles to emphasize and which practices to excuse or ignore. The identity is powerful because it gives Americans a shared sense of origin and purpose, a narrative that explains where they came from and who they are. But it is also fragile because it depends on maintaining silences, on not looking too closely at founding contradictions, on accepting mythology over history when history threatens the myths that hold the nation together. Perhaps the unresolved tension between freedom declared and freedom delayed is not a problem to be solved, but the permanent condition of American democracy, the gap between principle and practice, between aspiration and reality, between what the nation promises and what it delivers. Every generation inherits this tension and must decide how to respond. By attempting to close the gap through extending rights and freedoms to the excluded, by defending the gap as necessary for order and stability, by reimagining both freedom and democracy in ways that might finally reconcile them, or by accepting the tension as permanent and learning to live with contradictions that cannot be fully resolved. The American Revolution remains mysterious, not because we lack information about what happened. We have extensive documentation of revolutionary events and debates, but because we cannot fully reconcile its contradictory principles and practices, cannot make its pieces fit into a coherent moral narrative that feels honest rather than mythological. The mystery is not factual but philosophical. How do we understand and remember a revolution for liberty that accepted slavery? How do we celebrate a founding that required displacement and dispossession? How do we inherit principles we value from founders whose practices we condemn? Perhaps the mystery itself is the answer. Perhaps American democracy was founded on contradictions that were meant to be perpetually negotiated rather than permanently resolved. Established principles that exceeded practices and created productive tensions for subsequent generations to work through. Perhaps the revolution's incompleteness is its most important legacy, the gap between ideals and reality that gives marginalized groups language to demand inclusion, that makes defenders of inequality justify their positions against revolutionary principles, that keeps the founding dynamic rather than static, open to reinterpretation rather than fixed in mythological stone. The ruins remain physical ruins of burned towns and displaced villages. Social ruins of broken treaties and violated promises. Moral ruins of revolutionary hypocrisy that established a nation dedicated to liberty while practicing bondage and conquest. But ruins can be productive, can teach us about fragility and impermanence, can remind us that what was built by humans can be changed by humans, that no founding is so sacred that its consequences cannot be challenged or its principles extended beyond their original limits. And somewhere in those ruins, if we look carefully and listen patiently, we might hear echoes of the foreclosed futures, whispers of the roads not taken, possibilities that were defeated but not destroyed, alternatives that remain available if we have courage to imagine them and will to pursue them. The freedom that was declared and the freedom that was delayed exist in permanent tension, generating history that is still unfolding, demanding choices that each generation must make about whether to accept the founding's contradictions or to finally resolve them, whether to defend the revolution as it was or to complete the revolution as it might have been, whether to accept history's verdict or to write a different future. The American Revolution created a nation, but it did not create justice. That work remains unfinished.